The winter of 1942 descended upon the Soviet industrial heartland with a cruelty that matched the violence of war itself. In the coal-mining town of Krasnogorsk, located deep within the Ural Mountains, the ground trembled not from geological shifts, but from the relentless bombardment that had transformed a once thriving community into a landscape of shattered concrete and twisted steel. The siege had begun 3 months prior, when enemy forces encircled the region, cutting off supply lines and trapping nearly 15,000 civilians alongside the miners who had been working deep underground when the first shells fell. The town's strategic importance lay not in its modest size, but in the vast network of tunnels beneath it. Tunnels that housed critical manufacturing facilities relocated from the Western Front, facilities that produced components essential to the war effort. Above ground, the destruction was total. Below ground, in the suffocating darkness of collapsed shafts and flooded chambers, hundreds remained trapped, their voices growing weaker with each passing day. Among those who struggled to maintain order in this subterranean chaos was Dmitry Volkov, a veteran mining engineer whose 3 decades of experience had prepared him for cave-ins and equipment failures, but not for the systematic destruction of everything he had helped build. Volkov had spent his entire adult life in these tunnels, first as a young laborer during the rapid industrialization of the 30s, then as a shift supervisor, and finally as the chief engineer responsible for the entire Krasnogorsk complex. His hands, gnarled and scarred from years of handling machinery and shoring up unstable rock faces, now trembled as he studied makeshift maps drawn on salvaged paper, trying to calculate how many pockets of survivors remained isolated in the deeper sections. Beside him worked Anna Petrova, a geologist who had arrived just weeks before the siege to survey expansion possibilities, her academic training now repurposed toward the grim mathematics of survival. She had brought with her instruments designed to detect mineral deposits, but these same devices could theoretically locate voids in collapsed sections where air might still circulate and life might persist. The military presence added another layer of complexity to an already desperate situation. Colonel Sergei Karpov commanded the garrison trapped within the encirclement, a force of barely 800 soldiers equipped with dwindling ammunition and no hope of reinforcement, until the spring thaw allowed ground operations to resume. Karpov was a pragmatist who understood that his duty extended beyond military objectives to include the protection of civilians, yet every decision he made carried the weight of impossible choices. Should he deploy his limited manpower to defend the perimeter against probing attacks, or should he redirect soldiers to assist in rescue operations that might save a dozen lives but leave a section of the defensive line vulnerable? The colonel had fought in Finland and seen how quickly cold and hunger could break even the most disciplined units, and he recognized the same creeping despair in the faces of the miners and factory workers who looked to him for guidance. His chief of staff, Major Viktor Romanov, was younger and more idealistic, convinced that innovative tactics could overcome material disadvantages, and the tension between these two philosophies would shape the decisions made in the coming weeks. The initial weeks of the siege had been defined by reactive measures and desperate improvisations. When the surface buildings were destroyed, survivors flooded into the mine system, overwhelming the limited space and rapidly depleting oxygen in the sealed sections. Engineers like Volkov worked around the clock to establish ventilation using salvaged equipment, connecting abandoned shafts to create airflow and installing hand-cranked fans at critical junctions. Food became the next crisis, as the modest supplies stored underground were never intended to sustain thousands for an extended period. Rationing began immediately, with each person receiving barely enough to maintain basic function, and hunting parties ventured into collapsed sections to retrieve supplies from buried warehouses, risking further cave-ins with every expedition. Water proved surprisingly abundant due to underground springs, but sanitation quickly became a nightmare in the crowded tunnels, where disease could spread with terrifying speed. Medical supplies ran out within the first month, leaving Dr. Elena Sokolova, the town's only physician who had been underground treating an injured miner when the bombardment started, to perform surgeries with improvised tools and treat infections with poultices made from moss and minerals scraped from the tunnel walls. As December gave way to January, the psychological toll began to exceed the physical hardships. Children who had never known darkness beyond a night's sleep now lived in perpetual twilight, their cries echoing through chambers lit only by carefully rationed oil lamps and the occasional electric bulb powered by a failing generator. Families huddled together in alcoves carved into the rock, separated from neighbors by thin blankets hung as makeshift walls, privacy a distant memory in a world where every sound carried and every breath consumed precious oxygen. The miners themselves struggled with a unique form of anguish, for these were men who had built their identities around coaxing wealth from the earth, and now that same earth had become their prison. Yet even in this environment of grinding despair, the human capacity for adaptation began to manifest. Underground schools formed where teachers conducted lessons by lamplight. Musicians who had managed to save their instruments gave concerts in the larger chambers. Engineers like Volkov and scientists like Petrova began to ask a dangerous question. What if they stopped merely surviving and started actively seeking a way out? The turning point came on a morning that was indistinguishable from any other in the timeless underground world, except that it was marked by a sound no one expected to hear. Volkov was inspecting a collapsed section in the eastern galleries, accompanied by a small team of miners armed with shovels and timber supports, when one of the younger men held up his hand for silence. At first, there was nothing but the usual symphony of the deep earth, the distant drip of water, the settling groans of stressed rock, the shuffle of feet on stone. Then it came again, faint but unmistakable, a sound that sent chills through every man present. It was barking, not the imagined echo of memory or the auditory hallucination that plagued those who spent too long in the darkness, but the genuine, urgent barking of a dog somewhere beyond the wall of rubble that blocked the tunnel ahead. The implications were staggering because this section had been sealed for nearly 2 months, written off as inaccessible after a particularly severe bombardment had brought down hundreds of tons of rock and timber. If a dog had survived there, what else might have endured in those sealed spaces? Volkov immediately ordered his team to begin careful excavation while he sent runners to fetch Petrova and her detection equipment. The work proceeded slowly because the rubble was unstable, each stone removed potentially triggering a secondary collapse that would bury the rescuers alongside whatever lay beyond. Petrova arrived within the hour, breathless from navigating the warren of connecting tunnels, and set up her seismograph on the most stable section of floor she could find. The device had been designed to detect the subtle vibrations caused by mineral veins and geological faults, but she had spent weeks modifying it to pick up sounds and movements that might indicate survivors in collapsed areas. What she discovered sent a jolt of electricity through the growing crowd of observers. The readings showed not just one void beyond the rubble, but an entire network of chambers, and the vibrations suggested movement, rhythmic patterns consistent with living creatures rather than shifting stone. The barking came again, louder now as if the animal sensed the activity on the other side, and Petrova made a decision that would alter the course of everything that followed. She proposed they stop digging blindly and instead use controlled small charges to create a narrow access tunnel, a technique borrowed from mining but never attempted in such precarious conditions. Colonel Karpov arrived as preparations for the first blast were underway, his presence commanding immediate attention despite the informal setting. He listened to Volkov's explanation with the focused intensity of a man accustomed to making life-and-death decisions on incomplete information, then asked the question everyone had been avoiding. What if the chambers beyond contained not survivors, but enemy forces who had infiltrated through some unknown passage? The possibility could not be dismissed entirely, yet Karpov recognized that the potential reward outweighed the risk. He assigned a squad of soldiers to accompany the rescue team, ordered them to proceed with caution, and remained at the site to observe. The first charge was tiny, barely enough to crack the compacted debris, and the resulting opening was no wider than a man's fist. Volkov pressed his ear to the gap and heard not just barking but voices, Russian voices calling out in confusion and hope, and the sound of that human contact after so much silence brought tears to the eyes of hardened miners who had long since thought themselves beyond such displays of emotion. The voices spoke of a group that had retreated into a storage complex when the bombardment began, sealing themselves in with emergency supplies, losing track of time in the absolute darkness when their lamps failed, sustained by rationed food and the companionship of a dog that had belonged to one of the warehouse supervisors. Expansion of the access tunnel took another full day of careful work, with engineers constantly monitoring for signs of instability and adjusting their approach as conditions changed. When the opening finally grew large enough for a person to squeeze through, Volkov insisted on being the first to enter, despite the obvious danger. He crawled through on his belly, lamp clutched in one hand and rope secured around his waist. Emerging into a space that seemed impossibly vast after the confined tunnel, the beam of his lamp swept across stacked crates and machinery covered in dust, then found the faces of 47 people who had given up hope of rescue and now stared at him with expressions that mixed disbelief with desperate relief. The dog, a mongrel with matted fur and intelligent eyes, barked once more, and then sat down as if satisfied that its job was complete. Among the survivors were 12 children, 6 elderly residents who had been visiting relatives when the attack came, and 29 workers from various facilities, all of them weakened by malnutrition but alive. More significantly, the storage complex contained supplies that had been intended to support the relocated factories, machine parts, raw materials, and most crucially, 3 months' worth of preserved food rations that could immediately improve conditions for everyone underground. The rescue operation that followed tested the limits of what the exhausted community could accomplish. Each survivor had to be carefully extracted through the narrow tunnel, a process that took hours per person, because many were too weak to crawl unassisted, and the children had to be carried. Dr. Sokolova established a triage station at the tunnel entrance, examining each person as they emerged and prioritizing treatment for those in most critical condition. The discovery of medical supplies in the storage complex, including antibiotics and surgical tools, felt like a miracle to a physician who had been operating under medieval conditions. Yet even as the community celebrated this unexpected triumph, Volkov's mind was already racing ahead to the larger implications. If 47 people had survived in a sealed section for 2 months with a dog that somehow found enough air and moisture to live, what did that suggest about the stability and extent of the tunnel network? More importantly, if supplies had been stored in that one location, might there be other hidden caches scattered throughout the complex, resources that could extend their survival indefinitely? The barking of a desperate animal had opened not just a physical door, but a conceptual one, transforming their understanding of what might be possible in the lightless world beneath the siege. The successful rescue galvanized the underground community in ways that extended far beyond the immediate relief of recovering survivors and supplies. In the days that followed, Volkov convened a series of meetings with Petrova, Colonel Karpov, and the other technical experts trapped below ground, sessions that stretched late into the timeless night of the tunnels and generated ideas that would have seemed fantastical just weeks earlier. The central insight was simple but profound. They had been thinking like victims waiting for rescue, when they should have been thinking like the miners and engineers they actually were, people whose entire profession centered on extracting value from hostile environments and creating infrastructure when none existed. Petrova proposed a systematic survey of the entire accessible tunnel network using her modified seismograph, mapping not just the known passages, but the sealed sections, the flooded galleries and the mysterious voids that her instruments detected, but which appeared on no official plans. Volkov contributed his encyclopedic knowledge of the mine's history, recalling abandoned expansion projects from the 20s and experimental shafts that had been dug during the frantic industrialization period. Together, they began to assemble a picture of a subterranean landscape far more complex and extensive than anyone had realized. Major Romanov approached the project with military precision, organizing teams of soldiers and civilians into survey units that would systematically explore and document every accessible meter of tunnel. Each team carried standardized equipment: lamps, rope, chalk for marking walls, notebooks for recording observations, and most importantly, the portable detection units that Petrova had begun assembling from salvaged radio components and her seismograph parts. The Major understood that information was a force multiplier. That accurate maps and reliable intelligence about their environment could transform their strategic position from desperate to merely difficult. His teams worked in 6-hour shifts, pushing into areas that had been considered too dangerous or too remote to matter, and the discoveries came with startling regularity. They found sealed chambers containing coal reserves that could fuel their generators for years. They located underground streams that could provide fresh water indefinitely. They stumbled upon entire workshops that had been abandoned during the initial panic, complete with tools and raw materials. Each discovery was catalogued, mapped, and integrated into a growing database that transformed random facts into actionable knowledge. The dog that had inadvertently triggered this renaissance became an unlikely mascot for the community, a symbol of resilience and the unexpected paths to salvation. Someone named him Prospector, and he accompanied the survey teams with an enthusiasm that suggested he understood the importance of the work. Prospector had an uncanny ability to detect unstable sections before human instruments registered danger, his behavior changing in subtle ways that experienced miners learned to read and trust. Children who had been listless and withdrawn began to follow the dog through the safer tunnels, their laughter returning as they played games of hide-and-seek in the alcoves and side passages. The psychological impact of having a living creature that existed purely in the present moment, unconcerned with the siege above or the uncertain future, proved more therapeutic than any speech or propaganda. Dr. Sokolova noted in her medical logs that reported cases of depression and anxiety decreased markedly in the weeks after the rescue, a correlation she attributed partly to improved nutrition, but mostly to the renewed sense of agency and purpose that had replaced the passive waiting. Yet not all discoveries were positive or immediately useful. In one deep gallery, a survey team broke through into a section that had been flooded decades earlier during a spring thaw, finding machinery preserved in icy water, but also the remains of miners who had drowned in the sudden inundation, their bodies still recognizable after all those years in the cold, anaerobic environment. In another location, they encountered geological instabilities that threatened to cascade into a collapse that could seal off entire sections of the inhabited zone. Petrova spent days calculating the stress loads and designing reinforcement strategies, work that required diverting precious resources from other projects, but which could not be delayed without risking catastrophe. Colonel Karpov faced his own challenges as the expansion of the occupied territory stretched his defensive capabilities thinner. The entrances to the tunnel system were still vulnerable to enemy attack, and spreading the population across a wider area made evacuation and coordination more difficult. He instituted a system of underground checkpoints and communication posts, training civilians to operate as spotters and messengers, effectively creating a military infrastructure that integrated seamlessly with the civilian one. By the end of January, the community had been transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible during those first desperate weeks. What had been a formless mass of frightened people huddling in the darkness had become an organized society with defined roles and systems. Engineers and geologists worked alongside soldiers and teachers, each contributing their expertise to the collective survival. The tunnel network itself had been reclaimed and reordered, with residential areas clearly separated from industrial zones, sanitation systems established using natural drainage patterns, and a communication network created using salvaged phone lines and a hand-cranked switchboard operated by elderly volunteers. Food remained carefully rationed, but the discovery of additional supplies and the implementation of a primitive hydroponic garden in a chamber with access to a hot spring gave hope that self-sufficiency might be achievable. Most significantly, the psychological shift from passive endurance to active problem-solving had rekindled something essential in the human spirit. When Volkov stood before the assembled community to present the results of the survey and outline plans for continued development, he saw not the hollow-eyed desperation of December, but the focused determination of people who had remembered how to hope. The discovery that would ultimately determine their fate came in mid-February during what should have been a routine survey of the deepest accessible levels. Petrova had been leading a small team into sections that dated back to the earliest days of the mine, shafts that had been dug with primitive equipment and followed coal seams that wound through the rock in unpredictable patterns. Her instruments had been registering anomalous readings for days, signatures that suggested large voids in areas where the geological maps showed nothing but solid rock. Initially, she assumed the readings indicated natural caverns, features common in this region, where ancient water flows had carved passages through softer stone. But as her team descended deeper and the readings grew stronger, she began to suspect something more significant. When they finally broke through a thin wall of rock into the space beyond, what they found exceeded even her most optimistic projections. It was a vast natural chamber, cathedral-like in its proportions, with a ceiling that vanished beyond the reach of their lamps and walls that glittered with mineral deposits. More importantly, the chamber was warm, heated by geothermal activity that manifested as a series of hot springs that fed into a dark pool at the center. The strategic implications became clear within hours, as Volkov and Colonel Karpov joined Petrova in the chamber to assess the find. The warmth alone was invaluable in an environment where cold had become a constant drain on energy and morale. But the hot springs suggested something even more remarkable: the possibility of establishing genuine agriculture. Back in the inhabited zones, the experimental hydroponic garden had produced modest results with improvised equipment and carefully rationed water. But here they had abundant heat, moisture, and space. Karpov immediately recognized the military significance. A secure, self-sufficient underground facility could hold out indefinitely, transforming the siege from a race against starvation into a contest of wills where time favored the defenders. He ordered Major Romanov to begin planning the relocation of essential personnel and equipment to this deep sanctuary while maintaining a presence in the upper levels to avoid alerting enemy forces to their enhanced capabilities. Volkov focused on the engineering challenges: how to create safe access routes capable of handling heavy equipment, how to ventilate the chamber without creating thermal signatures that might be detected from the surface, how to harness the geothermal energy for power generation. The next month became a period of intense, focused activity that pushed the community to its limits. Work crews labored in shifts to widen the passages connecting the new chamber to the main network, a task that required removing hundreds of tons of rock while simultaneously installing supports to prevent collapse. Carpenters and metal workers fabricated planting beds from salvaged materials, creating terraced gardens that would eventually hold crops. Petrova designed a water circulation system that used temperature differentials to create convection currents, eliminating the need for pumps and conserving their limited electrical power. Dr. Sokolova established a proper medical facility in a side gallery where the warm, humid air would benefit patients with respiratory conditions. Most ambitious of all was Volkov's plan to install a small turbine in one of the hot spring outflows, generating electricity that could power lights, tools, and eventually a radio transmitter powerful enough to communicate with Soviet forces beyond the encirclement. The project consumed resources at an alarming rate, and more than once, Karpov had to make difficult decisions about diverting materials from defensive preparations to support the construction efforts. Not everyone embraced the vision with equal enthusiasm. Among the military officers, there were those who argued that fortifying the upper levels and preparing for a breakout attempt would serve their duty better than burrowing deeper into the earth. Among the civilians, parents worried about moving their children even farther from the surface and the theoretical possibility of rescue. The miners themselves were divided, with the older generation uncomfortable abandoning the familiar tunnels they had spent decades working, and the younger men eager to prove themselves in this new endeavor. Volkov found himself acting not just as chief engineer, but as a mediator and motivator, spending his evenings moving through the work sites and residential areas, listening to concerns and explaining the vision in terms that resonated with each audience. He reminded the soldiers that they were not retreating, but establishing a fortress from which they could eventually counterattack. He assured parents that the warm chamber would be healthier for their children than the cold, damp tunnels above. He told the miners that they were doing what their profession had always demanded, going deeper to find the resources that would ensure survival. The first crops sprouted in late March, fragile green shoots of fast-growing vegetables that had been started from seeds found in the rescued supplies. The sight of living plants growing in the underground chamber produced an emotional response that took many by surprise. Grown men and women standing silently before the planting beds with tears streaming down their faces. It was proof not just that the plan could work, but that life itself could flourish in this place they had transformed from prison to refuge. Prospector seemed to sense the significance, spending hours lying near the gardens as if standing guard, his presence a reminder of the chain of events that had led from desperate rescue to agricultural miracle. As spring began above ground and the siege entered its 6th month, the community below had achieved something extraordinary. They had stopped surviving and started building a future. The tunnel network that had once been a temporary shelter was becoming a permanent home, and the people who had once seen themselves as victims of circumstance were beginning to understand that they were pioneers, proving that human ingenuity could create life even in the most hostile environments. April brought changes that rippled through both the surface siege and the underground society, changes that would test everything they had built and force them to confront the fundamental question of what they were willing to sacrifice for survival. Above ground, the spring thaw that everyone had anticipated arrived with dramatic intensity, turning the frozen battlefield into a morass of mud that slowed military operations, but also allowed Soviet forces to begin probing attempts to break the encirclement. The bombardments increased in frequency and intensity as enemy forces tried to prevent any relief efforts, and the constant vibrations from the explosions began to have alarming effects on the tunnel stability. Entire sections that had been safe for months suddenly showed signs of stress, with support timbers cracking and rock faces developing fresh fractures. Volkov and his team worked frantically to shore up the critical passages, but for every problem they addressed, 2 more appeared. The deep chamber that had become their sanctuary remained secure due to its position far below the zone of direct impact, but the access routes were increasingly precarious. Colonel Karpov received sporadic radio communications from Soviet command as atmospheric conditions occasionally allowed signals to penetrate, and the news was both encouraging and troubling. Relief forces were assembling for a major offensive that could potentially break through to Krasnogorsk within weeks, but the enemy was also reinforcing their positions, aware that losing this strategic point would compromise their entire regional defense network. Command wanted intelligence about the state of the underground facilities and the relocated factories, information that would determine whether the relief effort was worth the casualties it would inevitably cost. Karpov found himself in an impossible position. He could honestly report that the military garrison was intact and that the industrial capacity remained theoretically viable, but activating those factories would require access to the surface for ventilation and material transport, access that did not currently exist. He drafted careful responses that emphasized the resilience of the defenders while avoiding commitments about production timelines, bureaucratic language that might buy time but could not change the fundamental reality. In the deep chamber, life had taken on patterns and rhythms that felt almost normal despite the extraordinary circumstances. The first harvest from the gardens provided fresh food that seemed impossibly luxurious after months of preserved rations, and Dr. Sokolova documented measurable improvements in health markers across all age groups. Children attended schools where teachers used the rock walls as blackboards and incorporated geology and engineering into their lessons, turning the environment itself into a teaching tool. A workshop had been established where craftsmen produced furniture, tools, and even simple toys from salvaged materials, creating an economy of sorts where labor and skills were exchanged for goods and services. Musical performances and storytelling sessions provided entertainment and cultural continuity, with older residents sharing memories of the world above and younger people composing songs about their underground existence. Petrova continued her explorations, discovering additional chambers and passages that suggested the natural cave system was far more extensive than initial surveys had indicated, potentially connecting to other mining operations kilometers away. Yet beneath this facade of normalcy, tensions were building over a question that could no longer be avoided. What happened when the siege ended? Volkov had been giving this considerable thought, running calculations and models that painted a disturbing picture. The community had adapted so thoroughly to underground life that returning to the surface would present enormous challenges. The factories they had been protecting could theoretically be restarted, but doing so would require exposing the tunnel network and destroying the carefully maintained isolation that had preserved them. More philosophically troubling was the realization that many people, particularly the children who had spent formative months in the darkness, might struggle to readjust to surface life with its vast spaces and uncontrolled variables. He discussed these concerns with Petrova during one of their survey expeditions, and she offered a perspective that had been forming in her scientific mind for weeks. What if they were not just surviving a siege but pioneering a new way of living, proving that human communities could thrive in environments previously considered uninhabitable? The conversation that followed over subsequent days and weeks involved ever-widening circles of participants, from Colonel Karpov and Major Romanov to teachers and doctors and ordinary workers who had opinions about their collective future. Some argued passionately for a return to normalcy, for reclaiming the surface world that had been stolen from them and rebuilding what had been destroyed. Others, surprisingly many others, expressed hesitation about leaving the security and community they had built below. The tunnels had become home in ways that transcended mere familiarity, offering a sense of purpose and belonging that many had never experienced in their surface lives. The debate was rarely framed in such explicit terms, instead emerging through discussions about resource allocation, post-siege plans, and the theoretical timelines for various projects. But everyone understood the underlying question: were they refugees waiting to return home, or were they colonists who had found a new one? The answer would determine not just their immediate actions, but their place in the larger story of human adaptation and survival. The crisis that forced a resolution came with shocking suddenness in late April, triggered not by military action, but by geological forces that cared nothing for human plans or aspirations. A series of unusually powerful surface explosions sent shockwaves through the bedrock, with sufficient force to trigger the cascade of failures that Volkov had been dreading. Support structures in the main access tunnels collapsed in sequence, each failure increasing the load on adjacent sections until entire galleries were sealed by thousands of tons of rubble. When the dust finally settled, the damage assessment revealed a catastrophic reality. The primary routes to the surface were completely blocked, requiring months of excavation work to clear, and several critical storage areas had been crushed. Colonel Karpov convened an emergency council in the deep chamber. The military situation had become untenable in a conventional sense, with his garrison now having no practical way to defend surface positions. Yet, paradoxically, their strategic value had potentially increased because enemy forces would assume that the collapse had killed the defenders. Major Romanov proposed a bold plan: maintain absolute silence while secretly working to establish communication with Soviet forces through alternative means. If they could convince command that a capable force still held Krasnogorsk, the strategic calculus of the entire regional campaign might shift in their favor. Volkov supported the plan, but added a crucial technical component. If the natural passages were as extensive as Petrova's surveys suggested, there might be connections to other mine systems, or even to the surface at distant locations beyond the enemy siege perimeter. He proposed dedicating their best explorers to this search, accepting the risks in exchange for the potential rewards. Petrova immediately volunteered to lead the expedition, her scientific curiosity now aligned with desperate practical need. And she began recruiting a team of volunteers, willing to venture into the deepest, most uncertain parts of the underground realm. The decision to commit to indefinite underground habitation, rather than immediate rescue attempts, represented a philosophical transformation. Dr. Sokolova worked with teachers and community leaders to prepare everyone for what this choice meant. They were not abandoning hope of returning to the surface, but acknowledging that their path forward might be measured in years rather than months. She drew parallels to explorers and pioneers throughout history who had ventured into unknown territories and created new societies. The response was generally positive, perhaps because people had already unconsciously made this psychological transition during the months of building and growing in the depths. The exploration teams departed in early May, equipped with supplies for 2 weeks. Petrova led the primary expedition into the deepest known passages, following temperature gradients and air currents that suggested connections to the surface. A secondary team investigated the flooded galleries to determine if they could be drained and repurposed. A third group worked on the collapsed main tunnels, creating small listening posts where they could monitor surface activity. The remaining population focused on expanding the agricultural capacity of the deep chamber. As the teams dispersed into the darkness, there was a palpable sense that they had reached a turning point, that the choices made in the coming weeks would echo far beyond their immediate survival. Petrova's expedition into the deepest passages proved both more difficult and more rewarding than anticipated. The initial descent followed mapped tunnels that gradually gave way to natural formations, passages carved by ancient water flows. Her team moved carefully through this alien landscape, marking their route with chalk and ropes, documenting everything with scientific precision. On the 4th day, they emerged into a chamber that defied description. A natural cathedral where crystalline formations covered every surface, refracting lamplight into rainbow cascades. More significantly, the chamber showed clear signs of air movement from multiple sources, suggesting connections to the surface or to extensive cave networks. Petrova spent hours with her instruments, triangulating the airflows and correlating them with topographical maps. Her analysis suggested that one passage led toward mountains to the east, potentially emerging behind Soviet lines, while another connected to abandoned mines closed years earlier due to flooding. She split her team, sending 3 members back with reports, while she continued forward with 2 volunteers to scout the most promising passage. Back in the deep chamber, life continued with remarkable normalcy. The second harvest was underway, with crops providing enough food to build reserves. Children showed healthy growth, their adaptation complete. A school performance featuring original songs and plays drew audiences that packed the largest chamber, laughter echoing through ancient spaces. Dr. Sokolova noted that health metrics had stabilized at levels comparable to surface populations, a remarkable achievement given their environment. The psychological resilience was perhaps even more impressive, with depression rates remaining low despite uncertain futures. Colonel Karpov received sporadic intelligence from listening posts near collapsed tunnels. Enemy forces seemed to have concluded that the collapse had eliminated the defenders and had reduced their siege intensity. Major Romanov proposed exploiting this by establishing contact with Soviet command through Volkov's radio transmitter, coordinating with relief offensives and providing strategic intelligence. Volkov threw himself into the project with renewed energy, enlisting every electrician and mechanic to fabricate components. The breakthrough came on a warm May evening underground. The transmitter crackled to life with static that resolved into a Soviet military channel. The emotional impact of hearing outside voices after months of isolation was profound. Karpov composed the first message: garrison intact, industrial facilities protected, request coordination. The response came hours later, confirming receipt and adjusted plans. In that moment, their status changed fundamentally. They were no longer isolated survivors, but active participants in the larger conflict, a strategic asset whose resistance had value extending far beyond immediate circumstances. The siege had not ended, but its meaning had transformed into something historians would later recognize as pioneering methods of survival, influencing military tactics and space exploration for decades. Coordination with Soviet command opened new possibilities, but imposed new pressures. Karpov balanced civilian needs against military demands requiring secrecy and discipline. Command requested intelligence about enemy positions, information requiring observation posts near the surface. Major Romanov volunteered to lead this effort, selecting soldiers and miners who could navigate partially cleared tunnels and establish concealed positions. The work was extremely dangerous, with constant risk of cave-ins or enemy detection, but it provided actionable intelligence. Simultaneously, Petrova's expedition achieved remarkable success. After 10 days through passages requiring swimming and climbing, her team emerged into an abandoned mine 8 kilometers from Krasnogorsk, beyond enemy lines. Within hours, A supply convoy was heading toward the mine entrance under escort. The psychological impact rippled through both military and civilian populations. They were no longer trapped. The deep chamber was not a prison but a fortress with a secret door, a sanctuary they had chosen. The arrival of first supplies sparked celebrations lasting well into the night. Prospector raced through crowds accepting pats and treats, his joy matching the humans around him. But practical minds were already planning next phases. Volkov worked with logistics officers to design efficient supply systems. Dr. Sokolova requisitioned medical supplies for previously impossible procedures. Teachers requested books and educational materials. Colonel Karpov coordinated with command to establish timetables for relief offensives. The civilian population faced complex choices. Now that escape was possible, each family had to decide whether to evacuate or remain. The decision was not straightforward because the surface world was still at war, with shortages and dangers that might exceed underground life. Parents debated weighing normal lives against security and community. Over several weeks, roughly a third chose evacuation, mostly families with young children. The departures were emotional but not bitter, with everyone understanding that choices were deeply personal. Those who remained doubled down on their commitment, implementing planned expansions. New chambers opened for workshops and social spaces. Agricultural terraces extended into areas with better geothermal heating. A primitive plumbing system was installed using salvaged pipes. Most ambitiously, Volkov designed a permanent power generation facility harnessing geothermal energy efficiently. The community was no longer simply surviving, but genuinely building something intended to last generations. Petrova authored detailed reports transmitted through military channels, documents that would eventually form the basis for studies on closed-environment life support systems and inform designs for Antarctic research stations and space habitats. The final act of the Krasnogorsk siege played out in early June, with coordination demonstrating what the underground community had made possible. Soviet forces launched a multi-pronged offensive, informed by detailed intelligence from Karpov's observation posts, and timed to coincide with a surprise attack from within. On a grey dawn experienced underground only through radio reports and trembling rock, Major Romanov led 200 soldiers through partially cleared tunnels and erupted from concealed positions directly behind enemy lines at a critical moment. The attack succeeded beyond expectations. Enemy forces, convinced the underground defenders were dead, had grown complacent in their defensive preparations. The sudden appearance of well-equipped troops from supposedly sealed tunnels created panic and confusion that rippled through their entire command structure. Within hours, Soviet forces broke through the encirclement from multiple directions, and by evening the siege was effectively over. Krasnogorsk was liberated, though the surface town was barely recognizable as rubble and scorched earth. For the underground community, liberation brought mixed emotions. Those who had evacuated earlier returned to find their former neighbors emerging from tunnels like creatures from myth, pale but healthy, organized and purposeful. The contrast between the destroyed surface and the thriving underground society was stark and unsettling. Military officials and journalists who descended into the deep chamber to document what had been accomplished struggled to find words adequate to describe what they witnessed. Here was a functional city carved from rock, with farms growing under artificial light, workshops producing goods, schools teaching children, all sustained by ingenuity and collective determination. Volkov and Petrova found themselves hosting delegations of scientists, engineers and military planners who wanted to understand every detail of what had been created: the geothermal power system, the agricultural techniques, the social organization that had prevented the psychological collapse, expected in such confined conditions. All of it was documented and analyzed. Prospector became something of a celebrity. His role in the initial rescue that had sparked the entire transformation, making him a symbol of hope and unexpected salvation. The dog seemed bemused by the attention, but accepted it with his characteristic calm. In the weeks following liberation, a decision had to be made about the future of the underground facility. Some argued it should be sealed and abandoned, a temporary measure no longer needed. Others recognized its potential value as a secure research facility or emergency shelter. Colonel Karpov and the core group who had chosen to remain underground advocated for a third option: maintain and expand it as a permanent installation, demonstrating that human habitation was not limited to the surface, that communities could thrive in environments once considered impossible. The legacy of Krasnogorsk ultimately extended far beyond the immediate military victory or the remarkable survival story. In the years following the siege, the underground facility was not only maintained but expanded into a research center, studying closed-environment life support systems, becoming a proving ground for technologies that would eventually enable human presence in extreme environments, from deep ocean installations to orbital stations. The agricultural techniques developed in the geothermal chambers were adapted for use in northern communities where conventional farming was impossible, feeding populations that had previously relied entirely on imported food. Volkov continued as chief engineer of the expanded facility until his retirement, training a new generation in the principles of sustainable underground engineering. Petrova's cave explorations revealed an entire network of passages connecting multiple mine systems across hundreds of square kilometers, passages that were eventually developed into a secure communication and transportation network that proved invaluable during later conflicts. Her scientific papers on the geological formations became standard references, and she was credited with establishing the field of applied underground ecology. Colonel Karpov rose through military ranks, his experience at Krasnogorsk informing defensive strategies that emphasized resilience and adaptation over purely offensive capabilities. Major Romanov survived the war and later worked with civil defense organizations designing emergency shelter systems for cities, incorporating lessons learned during those months underground. Dr. Sokolova published extensively on the psychological and physical health effects of extended underground habitation, her work becoming required reading for anyone planning long-duration space missions or polar expeditions. The children who had spent formative months in the tunnels grew into adults with unique perspectives on human potential and environmental adaptation. Some became engineers and scientists, others teachers and artists, but all carried with them the understanding that limitations were often more perceived than real, that human ingenuity could create life and community in the most unlikely places. Prospector lived out his years as a pampered resident of the facility,